Now, Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner testified before the Senate Finance Committee today to push the idea of a bank tax to recoup TARP funds. It would place a fee on financial institutions with more than $50 billion in assets, which at the end of the day ends up being only 1% of banks in the U.S. So aside from Wall Street complaining that the tax would be unfair, senators pressed Geithner to confirm that if this tax was indeed put in place, the money would go towards paying down the deficit, a question which Geithner conveniently sidestepped. So is this whole bank tax a good idea? And are Geithner and Obama really serious about making Wall Street pay? Earlier, I spoke with Dorsey, the Director of External and Governmental Affairs at the Economic Policy Institute. All right, Christian, before we get started with the interview, I'd like us to listen to a quick soundbite of Timothy Geithner explaining why he wants to enact this bank tax.
Enacting this fee now will make it clear to the American people that they won't have to shoulder the direct cost of TARP.
Okay, so he's trying to make it very clear to the American people that this is all for them. Is this a sincere attempt? Do we really think that they want to help out the American people in this case? I mean, this is coming from Timothy Geithner, somebody that was just fine with TARP when it passed, someone that himself is from Wall Street. So are they pandering to the people on this one? Can we really think he wants to change anything?
There's a little bit of pandering, but this is still a good thing. And don't dismiss it because it plays well in Peoria. This is rightfully to try to get revenue from financial institutions whose risk played a part in not only the financial crisis, but in millions of Americans losing their jobs, losing their homes, losing access to credit, not spending, which has created the worst downturn since the Great Depression. So this is a small way of getting some of that back. It's not really going to help anyone who's lost their job, but it's really going to make them feel better at the end of the day.
Well, one of the things I worry about here is that it's focusing on the past and getting the money back from what was already paid in the past. But if we look at the future, Geithner is assuming that proposing this tax is going to make other banks not want to take risks anymore, that this is going to discourage them from doing that. Really, a little tax? I don't see that happening. I don't see banks not wanting to take risks anymore. I think that what really needs to happen is a clear, complete change of the financial system in this country.
Alyona, I agree. The best way to deal with risk is to regulate the heck out of it so that banks don't engage in that behavior. But you then have to ask yourself, well, what do you do for the financial institutions who are carrying a little bit too much risk and you don't have the regulations to back it up? Do you just let them continue to do that, posing a threat to you and me and our livelihood? Or do you take some of that back for the general treasury? So I think this is a common sense thing to do, but if this were the only thing that the administration and Congress would do, it would be a drop in the bucket as far as the real reform that could be done.
And at the end of the day here, it's only going to be 1% of banks that end up getting this tax. I also want us to listen to another little snippet of Timothy Geithner and his explaining why that is.
And we chose one that would have the additional benefit of falling most heavily on firms that are taking the most risks. So the virtue of this design is it's like you can think of it as a too big to fail tax. A tax.
Too big to fail tax. Wouldn't have that been wonderful if we would have thought of that before everything had actually failed? But let's be fair here. A lot of these too big to fail banks have indeed been paying back and have paid out the majority of their TARP money. So is this, too little too late?
This is what's so frustrating about the administration. They can do good things, but explain them for the very wrong reasons that make people scratch their heads and go, really? What? Too big to fail tax? This doesn't prevent too big to fail from occurring. What it simply does is it gets some general treasury money for organizations that are carrying too much risk. And the formula that they've come up with is fair and it makes sense and it's not going to do anything to stop lending and it's really not going to fundamentally change behavior. It's just going to take a little bit of that back in the event that we have future needs for bailouts. We should call it that. It's really not designed in any way to recoup the cost of TARP because, quite frankly, as quarters continue, we see that TARP costs less and less. So if you continue to talk about it as a TARP repayment plan, then eventually people are going to say, well, TARP is costing us virtually nothing, or maybe even we made a profit. Should the banks get their money back? Well, of course not. They owe money to the system that they've helped collapse.
That's right, and many of the senators today at the hearing, that was their problem, was that we were never going to fully know the cost of TARP until about 2013.
That's
so
right.
We're still years away from knowing that. But is it fair then that they don't tax Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, GM? I mean, Timothy Geithner said, well, these people didn't bring down the financial system, but you could say that GM definitely brought Detroit into ruins, and it brought down the auto industry.
Well, you know, but GM underwent bankruptcy, and that's a stringent restructuring, the likes of which the banks never had to go through. So GM has paid, and GM is actually paying its money back, which is something that doesn't get a lot of press usually, but GM has emerged from bankruptcy a lot stronger than anybody thought, and a lot more quickly than anyone thought, and they've had to pay in ways that are usually not known to every American. So, you know, we're getting from GM what we need. The banks are not immune. Even though they're paying it back at a profit, you've got to remember their recklessness caused so many millions of Americans to lose their jobs, their homes, and their futures. And that's something that they can't begin to repay with a little tax, the likes of which the administration has proposed.
Well, and the tax itself is only going to collect $90 billion over a span of 10 years, which, you're right, when we look at all of the TARP funds is a drop in the bucket. But I have another question to ask, which is that recently we've had the IMF, we've had the G20 pushing for a global bank tax, and the U.S. has been slightly hesitant about this. So is this their way of telling them, see, we do want to play ball, we will put a little tiny tax on 1% of our banks?
You know, great question. The rest of the world is far ahead of us on this. The United Kingdom for a long time has had what they call the stamp tax, which doesn't capture every financial transaction, but it captures stock trading. And the administration is proposing their plan, which is really in lieu of a Wall Street speculation tax or a financial speculation tax, which would cover stocks and bonds and derivative trading, and that would really be something. It would raise a lot of revenue, and it would hit every financial institution. And I think the administration is trying to put this out there as something that the whole world can come together around, because it's not quite ready to embrace a global financial transactions tax, which is really what would be needed if it were to be effective.
So perhaps this bank tax could be more for show, but maybe it's just a little bit too little, too late also. Christian, thanks so much.
Thank you.